Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 2. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 35 in our textbook, which involves landlord and tenant law. Some of the big picture, the overall learning objectives that I would like for us to kind of take away from this chapter is to understand different types of leasehold estates that exist or leasing arrangements. It's another way to describe that. We'll talk about how they're created, how they're extended, and then we'll kind of focus in on rights and duties that landlords have and kind of contrast that with rights and duties that tenants have. And then we'll discuss some of the potential tort liability issues that can arise if you are a landlord. So that's the overall kind of like focus for this chapter. This topic, I think a lot of students have some familiarity with because over the years, I think many of us have been in that situation where we've leased, whether it be an apartment, a townhome, a condo, a house. And so we have at least a little bit more of a background in understanding the nature of this type of transaction. So when we talk about a leasing arrangement, obviously the landlord could either be the owner or the representation of the owner for that property, and what they're looking for is they're looking for someone on a temporary basis to come in and take possession of the property for an agreed amount price per month. And so the tenant takes possession but not ownership of the real property. It's very important to have a well-drafted lease agreement so that you kind of basically provide the parameters for that contractual relationship. If you remember when we covered contracts in Business Law 1, if that was a variety of chapters because we went into great detail there. There's a lot of things where you can't just leave things to ambiguity or to vagueness. You have to be very clear and specific if you want to try and avoid any type of misunderstanding. And we'll see with these types of agreements, you can have them verbal, which I do not recommend. Written is always the best way to go because at least that gives both parties something to refer to, days, weeks, months after the contract has been entered into. Generally, there's three broad categories of different types of leasehold estates or just leasing arrangements. There's an estate where it's for years, and so again, that's maybe a specified period of time, from beginning to end. It could be periodic tenancy. That's where it's for a definite period of time that's renewed automatically unless there's notification that's given to either party as you approach the end of the lease term. I know Florida and in many other states, they usually require tenants that have, like, let's say, an annual lease agreement. If you do plan on vacating at the end of that year, you do need to give usually like 60 days notice. It can vary from state to state, but that's a standard kind of, kind of like time frame to follow. And then there's something called tenancy at will, which this is just an agreement where the lease lasts only as long as both parties want it to. Again, sometimes with lease arrangements, what I have seen is that, let's say a tenant is in an apartment or a house for, let's say, a year. And then at the end of that year, sometimes, based on, again, mutual agreement, it could convert into a month-to-month arrangement. So that would be like the tenancy at will. So there's really no obligation on either side beyond the next 30 days of the agreement once you get past that year completion of the original lease agreement. I mentioned how you can have oral or verbal agreements, but if they are going to last more than a year, then it does have to be in writing to satisfy the statute of frauds. So you could have, let's say, in the neighborhood where I live, there's a lot of like small apartments that are either attached to a house or maybe there's a separate detached apartment in the backyard. And so it provides supplemental income for the owners of the property. And so while they may occupy the dwelling, this supplemental apartment brings in extra income. And I've seen in some arrangements where renters will be brought in for these like small apartments, and it'll basically just be month to month. And so there's not necessarily a need to have something in writing. Again, not a good idea. But it is possible. But if you're going to go to a calendar year or longer, it does have to be in writing to satisfy the statute of frauds. For written agreements, this is where, at least that's required in writing to satisfy the statute of frauds, so it's a year or longer, or if it's just the preference of the parties. Then you do need to make sure that the agreement identifies the parties involved. So the landlord slash owner, whoever represents the ownership interest, needs to be identified. The premises needs to be identified, as well as who the tenant or tenants are going to be. You need to specify the duration, the amount of rent to be paid, and that it does need to be signed by the parties against whom enforcement is sought. So, again, I think many of you have, if you've rented an apartment or house, it is fairly clear in terms of all the provisions that are provided for, and it does need to be, written if it's greater than a year, and it does need to include these required details in case an issue arises. It's not uncommon for landlords initially, when they're screening potential tenants, to do like a background check, and that could include a credit report or at least a rental history that could be required, and that's normal. That's not anything out of the ordinary. And so should a new tenant kind of enter the scene, so let's say a particular person, he or she rents an apartment, and then months down the line, they get, maybe they get married, and so a spouse moves in, or it's just maybe a temporary thing. I've talked with a lot of landlords, and usually, if it's a temporary house guest, where someone is staying for the weekend or maybe even like a week or two, normally there's like no need to add people to the lease agreement. But if they're going to start receiving mail there, that usually is a clear indicator that, okay, they're going to be there for a while. Then they do need to be officially added. Part of that is, from the landlord perspective, that's a liability thing. You just want to know who is living where in the properties that you are managing and overseeing. And so if someone is not, legally entitled to be there, that can potentially impact the issue of liability. So, rights and duties of landlords. So they do have the right to enter and do like safety inspections, usually upon advance notification. Again, I've seen a lot of different kind of communities do different things, but it's not uncommon to do like maybe a monthly or quarterly, just kind of like an inspection. Maybe they're spraying for pests to check to see, if there needs to be any repair work done. Sometimes, tenants don't necessarily report damage as it occurs, or even if it's just routine maintenance issues. And so landlords do have a vested interest. They want to make sure everything is functional. Sometimes, that functionality is required under law, under this idea of habitability. So this idea of what's called a warranty of habitability goes to some very basic elements that landlords are required to provide to tenants in a rental arrangement. So the dwelling has to be in livable condition. It has to adhere to, state and local safety, health, and housing codes. Florida, just to give you an example, I'm going to advance a slide. It may be kind of hard to read. I know it's kind of small print, but if you're looking at this on your own computer or tablet, this is the Florida law, at least as of 2019, and it provides essentially what needs to be the requirements under this notion of habitability that landlords have to ensure is given to tenants. So if you look down, it talks about the landlord at all times during the tenancy shall, and it talks about complying with the requirements of building, housing, health codes. So that includes obviously wiring, plumbing, any type of electrical issues. All of those things need to be provided as per housing codes for well this dwelling actually is. In addition, it seems kind of odd that Florida would require heat in the dwelling as a form of habitability, but not air conditioning. I don't know how many of you are, but the idea of not having air conditioning in Florida, especially in the summer months, is really challenging. I remember it was several years ago. I forget which hurricane it was, but it kind of blew through. It was, I think, in September, and where I lived, the neighborhood didn't have power for like 2 days, and that was a rough 2 days. In my mind, I think AC is habitability, but according to Florida law, it's not. But heat is. Also, what is included is extermination of a variety of different pests, so rats, mice, roaches, ants, wood-destroying organisms, bed bugs. All of that stuff is required by the landlord to kind of exterminate. They aren't necessarily liable for damages, but to property, but they do need to make sure that those types of pests are taken care of. In addition, to have locks and keys, to have garbage removal outside, whatever the dwelling is, if it's a house or an apartment. And so those are really the critical things. And hot water, I see at the very end there, it talks about running water and hot water. So those are the core things that are required under the law for habitability. Now, the habitability requirements apply to residential tenants. It does not apply to commercial tenants. So if you're renting, let's say, some office space in one of those kind of like strip centers, or if it's like an industrial park, the rules are usually kind of relaxed in that environment, because the parties there are going to be usually two commercial entities. The landlord obviously is commercial, and then the tenant in an office environment is also going to be a commercial entity or a business. So tenants' remedies if there's a breach with any of these foregoing topics that we talked about, so possession, habitability, non-interference with use. So it's possible that if there is a breach of the lease agreement committed on the tenant by the landlord, it could result in termination of the agreement. It's possible, not always. There is also the notion of what's called constructive eviction. So not only like wrongful eviction, but constructive eviction goes to your ability to enjoy the property. So is the landlord doing something that is prohibiting your enjoyment? If it's an apartment, let's say they're doing major construction and it's at like late at night, and so it's interrupting your ability to sleep. That might be an example of constructive eviction. Damages, so again, reimburse for repairs if that's applicable. Rent remedies, sometimes you can withhold rent until the defect is remedied. Again, you just need to be careful there if you're going to, withhold rent or repair and deduct. A lot of times you do need to make sure you give the landlord opportunity to repair whatever is malfunctioning, especially if it pertains to something of an issue of habitability. So rights and duties of tenants. So under the law, there's generally the following obligations. So, there's a duty to pay rent. There is a duty to refrain from what is called committing waste or damage. So, obviously, when you move into a dwelling, if you want to hang some pictures on the wall, that's fine. But, if you want to create, a new entrance into a bedroom, cutting through a wall, that's not going to be permitted, because that's committing waste. Also, there's a duty not to use the premises for some type of illegal purpose. So that could be a violation of federal, state, or local ordinances in terms of the criminal code. Landlord's remedies, if they discover that one or more of these obligations of the tenant is being violated, so lease termination, pursuit of damages as applicable. Self-help involves peaceful removal of the tenant property if it's allowed. Normally, and yeah, I don't know, I think you guys remember I talked about this in Business Law 1. My dad, when he was alive, he was a real estate broker, and so I've gotten to know like a lot of interesting characters throughout Central Florida over the years. And I've seen some landlords or owners of property engage in self-help fairly aggressively. So if a tenant if they missed their rent payment, after a couple of weeks, I've seen landlords go in and physically just take everything out, all the property of the tenant, and just put it in the front yard. I don't recommend that from a legal perspective. There is a legal process. I know it's time consuming and it can be frustrating for owners, but there is a proper eviction process that you would go through. And if after a judicial kind of decree for permanent eviction from a property, if the tenant still doesn't move out, then you can get a deputy sheriff to assist. But again, that's the best way to do it. You start engaging in self-help, kind of like with repossession. You could see some issues that could possibly arise where things could get out of hand very quickly. So self-help, there are states that do allow it under certain conditions. Not necessarily, I think, a good idea from a potential liability perspective. Anyway, this was chapter 35. So as you have questions, as always, please message me. You can call, text, or email me, and let me know if you need assistance of any kind. But do have a very good, safe, productive rest of your week, and I'll be chatting with you all online. Thank you so much.